So thank you all so much for being with us. I'm so glad that we have as many people here as we do to come to this presentation on this very important topic. My name is Sarah Stout. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Prison Policy Initiative. And we're here today to talk about the many different ways that families stay in touch while loved ones are incarcerated, and some of the ways that those connections are under attack. And then hopefully we get some hope from two advocates who've been working very hard to help protect those methods of communication and connection. We're going to start with a brief presentation from me just to give an overview of the topic, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists and end with time for Q&A. Just some housekeeping. The chat is disabled, but the Q&A feature is enabled. So please, if you have questions, if you can put them in the Q&A section, we will do our best to curate those and answer them at the end. Uh, thank you all so much. I will be turning it over now to Emmett Sanders to introduce himself and give us a little bit of grounding in what we're going to be talking about.
Right. Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Emmett Sanders. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Analyst with Prison Policy Initiative. I've been with Prison Policy Initiative for around 3 years now. Prior to that, I did a lot of research advocacy work around carceral surveillance. But I also come to this work as a directly impacted advocate. I'm someone who's been through these very systems that we're talking about today. I was incarcerated for more than 22 years. And one thing that I can say with as much honesty as I can with certainty is that I did not do that time by myself. Um, like so many others in prison, my family and my loved ones were with me every step of the way. Visits, phone calls, the boxes of letters that I've saved over the years that are sitting right over there, actually. Some from loved ones who are no longer here. They were more than a lifeline to me. They kept me whole and they brought me home. And I share this because, like our panelists, like so many of you who are attending, I know firsthand how very vital these family connections are during incarceration. Um, so I'm grateful to you all for being here to share and to learn with us today. And I'm particularly grateful to our amazing panelists, Jodi Hocking of Return Strong and Taj Mahon-Haft of Virginia's Dehumanization Project, who have led such remarkable efforts to protect family connections in their states and have centered and impacted people and their families in the process. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it back over to Sarah now to talk about today's event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmett, and thank you for sharing sort of your experience. I know we're going to hear a lot more about people's personal experiences with these connections today, and I'm really honored to be able to hear about those and participate in the conversation. So I'm going to start by talking with a little bit of overview of just how do people maintain family and community connections when incarcerated? Incarceration is, of course, a massively isolating experience. It takes people physically and mentally far away from where they're from their families of origin, from their communities, and places them in a setting where their identity and humanity can be stripped away from them. Connections to the outside world are what help many incarcerated people keep their sense of identity, keep their sense of hope, and ultimately return to society able to be full members of it and be happy and healthy people. There's tons of ways that people maintain these connections, but the Bureau of Justice Statistics did do a sort of survey of how particularly parents in state prisons maintain these connections. And it's a huge range of things. In-person visits, physical mail, phone calls, and then new technologies that aren't reflected in this graph, things like e-messaging and video calls, which we've seen a huge growth of in the past couple years. You can see that the most common way that parents stay in touch with their children is through the mail, followed by phone calls and then visits. Visits are, of course, one of the more difficult ways to stay in touch because they involve often getting in a car and going quite far. Um, So these different methods all come together to form connections that people have, particularly with their children, but also with their family and their friends of other kinds. The cost of keeping connected, the economic cost of keeping connected is huge. There was a study in 2025 that tried to estimate the amount that incarcerated family members spend, or family members of incarcerated folks spend per year to take care of them and stay in touch. And it estimated that as for over $4,000. There's a total of $1.8 billion spent annually just on travel to state and federal prisons to visit immediate family members. So you can think of that as actually a very small percentage of uh, of the um, of the total amount of money that people end up spending on staying in touch. These costs disproportionately fall on Black Americans for a couple of reasons. One is that studies have shown uh, that Black Americans are more likely to visit and are more likely to spend money on phone calls for their loved ones. And the other is, of course, the disparate racial impact that incarceration has. Black folks are more likely to have multiple family members in custody. And for each family member, these costs are incurred because people are usually incarcerated at different facilities in different parts of the state, and must all be kept in touch with. So let's start by talking a little bit about visitation. And what I'm going to do over the next couple sections is talk about some of the empirical research that shows that these forms of connection actually matter. There are a lot of folks, including folks, from the correction side, who don't see the value of family connections and particularly things like visitation and phone calls. They see them as costly distractions from their day-to-day work. And the empirical research shows that this is the wrong way to look at it, for all sorts of reasons. And so I want to go through some of those reasons, looking at visitation, looking at phone calls, and then looking at postal mail. And we'll also talk about the different ways that these methods of connection are under attack and some of what we've seen as ways to defend them. So visitation and phone calls reduce recidivism. This is one of those things that I lead with, and I always want to put a disclaimer out there. Uh, we know that the thing that many people in society are the most interested in when we talk about incarcerated folks is whether or not they will go back to prison once they are released. I tend to think that that is a very narrow way to talk about the success or non-success of incarcerated people when they are released. Nonetheless, it's where the research is. And so I want to give that disclaimer by say that I think that this is a very small picture of what we should be thinking about when we think about whether people are successful when they're released. However, we know that receiving visitation leads to a reduction in both new felony arrests and in technical violations. There are multiple studies that show this dating back 50 years. And these studies have shown that actually each individual visit has an effect on decreasing recidivism. They were actually able to track that, someone who had 5 visits had a different experience than someone who had 3 or 1. Interestingly, these results all hold even when controlling for whether people overall have family support. So it isn't just that visitation is a proxy for whether you have family who are involved in your life. The act of visiting matters. Visitation also creates safer conditions inside. This graph is a graph of the rate of assaults after in-person visits were eliminated in Knox County. And in this case, particularly, in-person visits were replaced with video visits. And you can see in the graph that after a ban on in-person visits, there was a huge increase in the rate of assaults. We know that one additional visit per month in one study was found to reduce misconduct by 14%. It also reduced total time served. Those things are connected, right? People who, time served can be increased because people have misconduct tickets. So visitation also decreases the total amount of time that people spend in custody. Replacing in-person visits with video visits was associated with higher rates of assault, as I said. We also know that visitation is linked to reduced depressive symptoms in incarcerated people. And this creates this, we know that when incarcerated folks are dealing with fewer mental health systems, everyone in prison is happier. Misconduct is lower. People have more fulfilling lives. Guards report higher satisfaction with their own jobs. And generally, the prison is a safer place. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that, particularly post-COVID, and during COVID as well, there's been a huge restriction and attack on visitation as something that matters for incarcerated folks. We've always seen, I would say, that there have been punitive restrictions and loss of family visitation used as discipline in prisons. Visits can be taken away for disciplinary reasons, sometimes very minor disciplinary reasons. And it's particularly concerning because one of the trends that we've seen recently is departments of correction adding taking away visits as specifically a punishment for testing positive for drugs. And that's particularly concerning because obviously the reasons that people use drugs are often mental health related, the exact kinds of things that visits help, the exact kind of symptoms that visits help alleviate. So it's really a very counterproductive way to structure a discipline system. From the side of folks who are visiting, we've seen a lot of policies that have discouraged people from visiting their loved ones. We see arduous, humiliating, and unreliable screening processes that cause people to go through incredible amounts of basically trauma in order to see their loved ones, and get turned away unnecessarily, even after they've traveled often for hours and hours to reach a prison, only to be told that they can't visit because of something they're wearing or the faulty results of a test. We also see discrimination against, for example, folks who wear religious garb or who have disabilities that require them to have various kinds of devices that are not that the visitation room doesn't want, and just general arbitrary enforcement. There's often very little oversight of how corrections officers treat people in custody. I mean, who are visiting, and very little way to appeal or yeah, appeal those kinds of decisions. We've also seen the complete elimination of contact visitation in certain places and replacement with video calls. That trend has not been as intense as we feared it would be, but it is happening some places. There have been legislative efforts, however, to protect visitation. One bill I want to highlight is a bill HB 25 1013, so it's a bill in 2025, that was worked on by Together Colorado, that established that visitation is a right, not a privilege. And that has implications for the disciplinary kinds of measures that I'm talking about, because it means that people actually hold a right to visitation, an affirmative right. We've seen other kinds of efforts, which we will hear more about, I know, from Taj and some other folks, to make sure that screening processes are minimally and traumatic, especially for children, that dress codes are clear, publicly posted, non-discriminatory, and then that video calls, if they exist, are at least free, and that they don't replace in-person visitation, that they instead are a supplement on top of in-person visitation to give people more ability, not less ability, to contact their loved ones. So turning to phone calls a little bit, phone calls are a vital lifeline. They're among the most accessible forms of communication for all incarcerated people since they don't require travel. There are lots of incarcerated people whose family members simply cannot make it to the prison for all sorts of reasons. And phone calls are something that's often very accessible for most people as a way to stay in touch. Studies have shown that regular weekly phone contact with children can actually be even more beneficial than visitation in maintaining family connections. And that's probably because of frequency, right? The ability to talk to somebody every single week builds a kind of connection that much less frequent visits may not be able to. Because phone calls are so important for strengthening families, I want to talk about how those families benefit. About half of people in state prisons are parents to children under 18. And so there are actually more children with a parent in prison than there are adults in prison. We know that parent-child relationships improve with weekly phone calls. But we also know that people who have regular mail contact with their children, which we'll talk more about in a second, also report stronger parent-child relationships. These stronger relationships have lots of stream effects. Children who have these stronger relationships do better in school and are ultimately less likely to be arrested themselves in the future. So there are public safety benefits to visitation and maintaining connections that stretch far beyond prison walls. There's been progress, but also backtracking on the question of how much phone calls cost. Phone calls can be a huge cost to family members, usually requiring a per minute fee, as well as lots of other kinds of fees, like setup fees and fees to add or withdraw money. After decades of advocacy, there was a bipartisan act passed in 20, called the Martha Wright Reed Act, that clarified that the Federal Communications Commission can, in fact, regulate in-state calls placed from corrections facilities. And this was seen as a really big sort of hopeful sign that we would see lower rates across the country. We did briefly, but unfortunately, under recent years, the FCC has bowed to pressure from sheriffs and from telecom companies, and these rates have been hiked back up quite significantly. So what's the solution there? Obviously, unfortunately, federal advocacy at this point in time is difficult, as I think everybody can understand. There has, however, been a lot of movement at the state level and the local level to make phone calls free. And I want to direct folks to an organization called Worth Rises, which has really been doing a ton of advocacy and tracked the progress of free phone call measures across the country. If you go to their website, they have a May 2026, so a very recent impact report. And it notes that over 330,000 people currently have access to free phone calls in jails and prisons. We know too that we've been able to track what happens when you make phone calls free. And while this might seem obvious, I think it's important to state. When phone calls are free, people make more phone calls, and those phone calls are longer. And that means that we're getting more of the benefits that phone calls bring to incarcerated people and their families. And the last form of connection I want to talk about is postal mail. We know that mail is the most common way that children stay in touch with their incarcerated parents. Um, Mail is something that has not been studied as much in the empirical literature. So there aren't as many studies that say, getting a certain number of letters has this effect. But what we know from talking to incarcerated folks is how many intangible benefits, unmeasurable benefits mail communication has. Being able to share children's drawings and see loved ones' handwriting, being able to keep physical mail in your housing unit or in your cell, even when something like tablets are taken away. And then, as Emmett pointed out, because our incarceration terms in the United States are so long, so many incarcerated people and their families lose loved ones during incarceration. And mail can be the one physical keepsake that people get to keep of people that they love. We put together a toolkit on mail scanning, which I'll talk about in a second, that is on our website. And as part of that toolkit, we sent out questions to incarcerated folks that Prison Policy Initiative has contact with around the country. And in the next couple slides, I've included some of their quotes that they sent back to us about postal mail and how important it is to them. Prisoners, and I'm using language that they used, so I want to be clear about that. I don't usually use the word prisoners, but the person who was writing did. Prisoners know their partner's handwriting in special languages. They've seen their children's pictures evolve over time. For a large portion of inmates, their loved ones are the main reason they try to succeed upon reentry. So the major threat that we're seeing to postal mail is not the total elimination of postal mail, which would actually have constitutional implications, but instead the concept of mail scanning. Mail scanning, when we talk about it, is the practice of digitizing mail in some way and either providing photocopies or sometimes only electronic versions to incarcerated people. This trend is growing across the country, and now 31 states and the federal prison system now scan mail. So the majority of states have some sort of mail scanning practice. Mail scanning makes the communication process and makes postal mail demonstrably worse. Scanned mail is often really low quality. It's frequently misdirected or misplaced. It often comes, things like children's drawings often come through without really being able to tell what they are, or certainly being able to experience the tactile feeling of actually holding your child's drawing in their hand. It also allows openings for private companies to profit. For example, by charging for physical photocopies or by promoting e-messaging, basically making the process of mail so unappealing that something like e-messaging, which they can charge for, seems like a better option. And although legal mail, mail to lawyers, is usually subject to different rules than personal mail, there is lots of mail other than mail with family members that is affected by mail scanning. And one of the things that I know Emmett has talked a lot about in his work is educational mail. People who are in higher education programs and other kinds of programs where they need to correspond with the outside world, mail scanning can be a huge impediment to that by basically delaying and restricting the way that that mail comes back and forth. The reason most corrections folks want mail scanning, the stated reason, is about contraband and drug use. The argument is that drugs are coming in on paper through mail, that basically people from the outside are sending drug-soaked paper into jails and prisons, and that's fueling drug use and the drug trade inside prisons. But the evidence is clear. Mail scanning has simply not reduced overdoses, and it hasn't reduced contraband in states that have implemented it. There were lots of states that really hoped that they would see major differences in their drug use rates after mail scanning. They just didn't. Pennsylvania implemented mail scanning in September 2018, but saw positive drug tests nearly triple in the 5 years that followed. And then a state to watch, I'd say, if you're really curious about the data behind this, is Illinois. Illinois is, I believe, the most recent state to implement mail scanning, certainly one of the most recent states. And as part of that process, the legislature required the Department of Corrections to produce data on its effectiveness. And it simply hasn't had a substantial impact on contraband. There wasn't a major change in overdose deaths. There wasn't a major change in the amount of drugs recovered. There wasn't a major change in the amount of drugs recovered either through the mail or not through the mail. So there has been basically nothing to justify this change that took place at this point now a couple months ago. Part of the reason for this is that mail scanning doesn't address major sources of contraband. It is certainly true that some drug contraband does come in through mail. We can't deny that. But mail scanning ignores staff as a major source of contraband. Unfortunately, low pay, poor oversight, lax employment standards have made drug smuggling a very lucrative and attractive business for some corrections officers. And there are it becomes kind of an open secret when these things begin to be discussed in the public in legislatures and other settings that corrections officers know that sometimes it's their colleagues who are a major source of contraband. Hundreds of corrections officers around the country have been prosecuted for drug smuggling. One person in Illinois who we spoke to noted that scanning mail doesn't stop the drug flow, but it does make the prices go up. The people who sell contraband in prison love it. And that does make sense because mail scanning isn't addressing major roots of contraband. It's not really getting at the root of the problem. So how do we get at the root of the problem, and how do we oppose mail scanning as sort of a false solution to this problem? The first thing that we generally suggest is that there's an insistence on data collection. This is also something where there have been a couple bills in Illinois that are worth looking at as textual examples of how to write this, as well as in Nevada, as Jodi will talk about. But here's some of the questions worth asking. How many pieces of mail have tested positive for drugs and for what substances? I'd add, how are you testing the mail and is that method reliable? How many incarcerated people or staff have experienced suspected overdose? How many staff have been suspected of or investigated for drug-related contraband, and what was the outcome of those investigations? The second thing to to insist on is addressing the cause of contraband, not just the effect. We know that the reason people use drugs behind bars is similar to the reason that people use drugs outside of custody: hopelessness, mental health issues, feelings that there isn't really another option, are all at play. And so serious investments in mental health and and other programs that support incarcerated people are the best way to get at the source of the problem. Lastly, if mail scanning does exist in your state or is a foregone conclusion in your state, there can be bills that can be passed to mitigate the harm caused by mail scanning. For example, making sure that that the mail scanning process remains free for incarcerated people and their families. I'll end with one quote from an incarcerated person in Alabama who we spoke to. Physical mail is so important because it carries a certain tangibility that is stripped away when scanned and turned digital. The feeling and the essence of physical mail one can touch fades when digital. It's like you can't see and feel the love and contents anymore when it's scanned. And with that, I will turn it back over to Emmett to talk to two completely amazing advocates who have worked on visitation and mail scanning issues in two states to talk more about those efforts and how to replicate them elsewhere. So I'll give it back to Emmett.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So now we're going to turn to a conversation with our panelists to learn more about their efforts to fight for families in Nevada and in Virginia. We're going to learn more about their work and about some of the strategies that they've used to protect those lifelines that we've spoken about. So I'll just do some quick introductions here. Taj Mahon-Haft here is the executive director of the Humanization Project. It's an organization that works to bring humanizing perspectives on criminal justice reform efforts across Virginia and beyond. Their work is led by and centers the lived experience of those whose lives have been shaped by the weight of doing time, including Taj himself. His work with the Humanization Project is directly informed both by his academic training as a sociologist, but also by his own lived experience inside Virginia's prisons, where he served 10 years. And that lived experience drives and shapes his work always, both for the his loved ones that were impacted by his carceral journey, and for everyone that's still inside or suffering that trauma. Taj also serves on a number of other committees and coalitions, including the Virginia Coalition on Solitary, the Restorative Justice Legislation Coalition Steering Committee, the Expungement Council, the New River Valley Reentry Council, and so many others. He has published on the leaders behind bars, parents behind bars, drug courts, survey methodology, inequalities in the criminal legal system, and so on. Taj is an avid hiker, passionate teacher, diehard Oriole and Ravens fan, and an unabashed hugger of trees. But above all, Taj is a drop everything father. He's a son, he's a partner, he's an eldest brother, and he's a friend. And we're also joined by Jodi Hocking. Jodi is the founder and executive director of Return Strong. Return Strong is a grassroots organization led by and for people impacted by incarceration, those currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and their loved ones, the family of those who are incarcerated. Before founding Return Strong, Jodi spent nearly a decade organizing unions across the country, including work supporting low-income workers in New York's fight for a living wage. When her partner was incarcerated during COVID after a parole violation, she was outraged by the injustice of the system and channeled that outrage and her organizing skills into uniting impacted families in Nevada. Today, Jodi leads Return Strong's fight for prisoners' rights through oversight and accountability of Nevada's prison system, working to end solitary confinement, protect the mail, visitation, and communication, all these things that keep people and keep families connected, and to drive lasting cultural change inside Nevada's facilities. So, Jodi, Tosh, thank you so much for being here with us today. Really, really excited to learn more from y'all and just to have a conversation. Um, maybe we can just start with a bit of an orienting question, actually, just a big picture kind of question. Um, why are family connections so important when we talk about criminal legal system reform? I mean, mail, visits, these kinds of things, they might necessarily seem as urgent as getting people home or reforming parole or probation systems. Why are we talking about this? Why are they so important?
I was just gonna do the same thing, Todd. Um, I think that just in and of itself, family connections are instill hope for people. So when they are really like at the end of their rope with prison, with conditions, with being incarcerated, that being able to talk to somebody who cares about you and cares about what happens to you, that keeping those connections are important. Um, I'm going to keep saying, I told you this the other day, but I equate it to 9/11. 9/11, we think often about the people that were in the towers or the people that were on the planes and the victim of that. If you look at mass incarceration and the incarceration of the hundreds of thousands of people, more than that, maybe, I always forget what the number is, in the United States alone, and then you look at the impact, the ripple effects into families. And we're an organization that has become very predominantly women. It's the moms and the aunts and the girlfriends and the wives, and like it is rare, but you take that and you expand it out into your family tree and you look at all of the people that are impacted by that, and we forget about those people. So teachers aren't thinking about, they might not even know that a child has an incarcerated parent. You're going to work every day dealing with the burden. And I think all of those things create, it's not just for the person, it's that ripple effect is why this piece of work is so important to our communities and public health, sociology, all of those different fields.
Yes, everything Jody just said. And I want to just highlight something and then elaborate a touch. So because my answer to this question is because for everybody out there, when you had your hardest time in life, what got you through it to the other side? I think it's our loved ones in all of our cases. And because as long as we're going to have a carceral system, the best way for the fewest consequences, the least trauma, the best coming out of the other side is going to be together. Because when I first came home, the person who I stayed with was my fiance. The person who helped me get all my Medicaid stuff sorted out was my father. The person who introduced me to my first legislator was a friend. And the person who gave me clothes to wear to those meetings was a different friend, right? The list goes on. We rely on people when we come home. And I will say this is not even a one-way street. All of the evidence in the world, you guys already highlighted it. Part of the reason I'm so excited to be talking with PPI is because I don't have to be the one bringing all the numbers. Thank you, Sarah. That was phenomenal. But all of the evidence, every stakeholder involved, the children, the partners, the people coming home, even the safety of officers at the facility, and certainly taxpayers who don't have to spend as much reincarcerating people or having as long a sentence as you highlighted. Everybody benefits when we have strong relationships. And I think I want to, because I don't want to just go on forever because I love this topic, but I really will highlight a couple final thoughts that I think everybody can relate to. And by the way, I'm sorry I'm speaking so fast. I really just caught myself already with that. Very passionate topic. I think the best way to answer this question is because when one person gets locked up, everybody who loves them gets locked up with them. And because had I not had my loved ones with the support they provided, especially those visits, I would not have survived my incarceration, let alone come home and thrived as a fact.
I genuinely appreciate that. I appreciate you share both so much for sharing that. I think you make such great points. Particularly, Jody, you're talking about like the ripple effects and the students who may go to school, the teachers don't even know that they're being impacted in such a deep and lasting way. And Taj, I completely agree. My family is the reason I am here, and I know how important that is, and I really, really appreciate you sharing that. I am wondering though, because you both have this direct sort of connection with it, right? This direct connection with incarceration. How do you sort of balance the intersection with getting things done for the impacted community? Because there is that responsibility there, with also having to deal with the sort of existing power structures that you have to navigate to do so.
So I will, yeah, my turn. First sacrificial victim. Um, this is the greatest tension in this work for me, to be honest, because I don't say this publicly a lot. I think this is a safe space to do so. I am a very far left individual in all of my personal policy stances. I'm a former academic. I'm all about being pure to the best possible way to not leave anybody out. And then I live in Virginia and work, or I work primarily in Virginia. And that is a state that is a purple state that does not want to do anything that is not incremental and does not ever want to be first to do anything. So the options are really left to be like, how do you get anything done for the people you left behind? And so that's where I land, and that's a big part of my balance on this is I want to make sure any work we're doing as an organization or as a justice impacted community more broadly, my perspective on it is always going to be informed by lots of conversations with the folks inside who are still my friends and still really guide the work, as well as some conversations with my friends out here who are systems actors or work in this same space who do also understand the dynamic of an institution can't do certain things overnight. It's not actually possible. And having to marry those two, it's not always easy. And that's where the third piece, lots and lots of conversations with a lot of people in the community who are not just me. I love coalition work as much as I can. I get on coalitions, and actually, the work related to visitation is something that is certainly by no means just our organization or me. We were a big part of that process, but it was an entire coalition. So I'm going to real quick say every conversation here is informed by Sisters in Prison Reform, Bending the Bars, Brilliance Behind Bars, Up to Date Inside Virginia, Survivors for Justice Reform, LAJC, ACLU, Ray, Grateful, the other people on the coalition that have been so much a part of moving this forward, and having those conversations help strike that balance.
Really appreciate that. Uh, Jodi, I know that you also do Return Strong, works with a lot of folks who are incarcerated, currently incarcerated, making sure that their voices are considered in this as well. Do you have maybe you have some thoughts about this intersection that we're mentioning as well?
So will you repeat the first question about what the
Sure,
balance was?
sure.
Because I
Um,
got all engrossed in what Taj was saying, and now I want to make sure that I
no,
answer the right question.
Taj is a great speaker. We're talking about the balance between being responsible to the incarcerated population, the impact of folks that you're sort of representing, that you're trying to do work for, while also navigating these power structures, like the different power structures that are preventing those, policies that actually recognize families from taking place.
I'm gonna again, I want to repeat what Tosh said. I'm not going to name everybody off because I'll forget someone, but none of this is any one person or one organization, right? Like there are tons of people who they step up on certain issues and we jump in and follow. And then the same thing happens when we're talking about visitation and communication. Like there are people that are backing us. I think one of the critical things for us is early on, and it could be like my background in labor organizing, is specifically looking for like what are the systemic problems, and
Mhm.
then educating everybody involved. So, you know, a great example is there was just a news article the other day. We should have free phone minutes, which is great. I would love if we could get free phone minutes, but the way like the budget and prisons are funded in Nevada is just not possible right now. We have other things that we have to do before we get to that. One of the ways that I balance that is making sure that I'm educating families and incarcerated people, or at least giving them the opportunity to get educated on them, so that we're like pointing at the correct target, so to speak, and then balancing that, centering the voices of people if they're not upset about it, then we're not taking it on as an issue. If nobody cared about free phone minutes, then fine, I don't care about free phone minutes. I mean, that's not really true, but the we have to select like which things we're able to actively work on. That's one of the ways that I think we make sure we're centering the voices of people who are impacted while we're working within power structures. And it is building coalition. It's sometimes it's educating the other organizations on this issue because maybe they work on housing reform, but they don't include how that affects impacted people. So we want to get on that. And so those are the ways that I think we work through balancing them. And some of it also requires some finesse with Department of Corrections because they don't, traditionally, and I'm sure most of the people on here, we have been very lucky the past couple of years to have a director that actually will at least listen and communicate. Not that it's a perfect like working relationship, but I use union negotiate. I was working in contract negotiation. And so sometimes finding that sweet spot where we can have a consensus when we really disagree, for instance, about the mail, like we can't come to the sweet spot on that. So it continues to be a battle. So I think all of those things, centering voices and making sure that we are not always only calling out, but sometimes we're calling in some of those power structures without compromising our own values in the process.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. To that, let's actually back up a little bit and sort of dive into like the individual fights that y'all have sort of been involved in, if you don't mind. Um, Jodi, you and the folks at Return Strong, you were able to sort of get ahead of efforts to implement mail scanning in Nevada, which is pretty remarkable. Can you maybe just talk a bit about what that looked like, how you're able to sort of organize such an effective response?
So the funny part of that story is it happened by accident. We were just starting, and this is not a plug to you guys, although it is a plug to you, is I obsessively read PPI. I look at like what's going on around the country, what things are happening, how do I literally you are my go-to for every like to get a view of what's happening nationally on different topics. And so back in 2021, we were only like probably 6 months old and had really developed by accident in response to the pandemic, in response to things that NDOC and the old director were doing that were horrifically damaging to people and families. And so one of the things that families were pushing for was we want tablets. And I was reading everything with you guys, and I was like, we can't fight for tablets without making sure that we protect visitation and the mail. Because if you watch across the country, as soon as they give tablets, they take those things away. In 2023, we had a bill, we had an assembly person that wanted to help us protect the mail. We had, in 2022, we got a stay from the governor, which was like shocking. And we were still so new, like we were just trying to figure it out, right? Um, and then in 2023, a legislator picked up a bill on the mail, and the director, the legislator, and myself sat in a room and argued for hours about was there a sweet spot? I always think of like the Venn diagram, right? You're mapping sentences in like fifth grade, and there's that little part where we can agree on. That's where I focus. I don't really care what he thinks, but at the end of the day, what can I agree on with him so that we can move forward? And so when we were negotiating that bill, he said he would never agree to it and the governor would never sign it if there was not like an out to if there was a safety and security risk to prison. So I'm going to tell you guys what was going on in my head at the time, but I knew that the argument was regarding K2 and spice. Well, the same thing, synthetic marijuana. That's what they can't detect on the mail. And so it gets inside anyway. He offered, I didn't beg him to do it. He offered and said, well, if you'll agree to saying, unless the director can prove with evidence-based data that the mail is what is causing the problem. And in my head, I was thinking, he can never prove that. Like, no, we're not ever going to get any rest because he's going to keep trying and we have to keep fighting, right? But it's impossible to pick it up on mail. So, and I don't want drugs. Let me just say this clearly. Like, I'm not trying to keep drugs in facilities. That's not the goal. But in there, so now we just keep pushing back every time. It gives us a little more time to organize about whatever their newest argument is, right? Right now it's drugs and overdoses again. I forgot what the initial question is, and I'm going to take the whole time if I don't pause there. Um,
No,
but so that really getting there and like watching for it is, as an organization, I wouldn't sign off on tablets. And there were a lot of people that were, excuse my mouth, but pissed off at me about that. And were like, I don't want to be a part of Return Strong because that's not, but what they didn't understand was we could lose everything. And that's fine. If you're a short termer and you're a short timer and you're only going for a year or year and a half, that's one thing. But I always am trying to think, what about our DR people? What about our life without parole? Like if they lose visit or they lose mail, then what happens? Like they live the rest of their lives without any emotional, physical contact with their loved ones.
I was, that's entirely true, right? We just have to sort of center the most vulnerable among us in these conversations, I think. One of the I was just kind of curious. One of the most crucial things you were able to do was sort of do that to make sure that it was based in evidence. Have they been able to provide any kind of evidence? How are they sort of subvert this requirement?
So, I mean, corrections, I won't even see in Nevada only. Corrections in general is horrible about keeping accurate data. Their data is like very shaded to prove their point. And so we've built relationship with legislators that now when they say something, and the director knows this, I will get a phone call from a legislator that's saying, they're saying X, Y, and Z. Is that really true? Like we're the trusted source now of we're not like I don't respond emotionally. I don't, not that I don't want to, but it doesn't get me anywhere, right? We have to tell the story and the data. Both those things have to exist. They have not ever been able to meet the requirements. So for instance, there was a review of the mail. They decided they wanted to take the mail. And really part of the problem is, in my opinion, they think it's a cakewalk. They can just walk in and take it. But we have to keep holding the line. It might not win it and kill what they want to do, but the longer we hold the line, the more that they come to the table to negotiate. Right. So maybe we're not going to lose physical mail, but we might lose X, Y, and Z, like one piece of it or something, printed copies. I don't know what it's going to be. The hope is that we can force them into such a corner. I say I always keep them on the ropes. I get them on the ropes and keep them there. They can't ever quite get their balance. So the data study that they did, they only tested in one facility, our max facility in the state that has the most violence, disciplinary problems, drugs going into the facility, all those things. Horrible, like situation in that facility. They took what they learned from that facility and applied it statewide as if every facility had the same rate that the highest risk facility had. Then on top of it, they took those numbers and applied them to overdose rate statewide, medical overtime statewide, but that's apples and oranges. That's not how data and research works. And so we went to legislators that either are our champions or we went to legislators that we knew would be like, this isn't data. I'm a professor at such and such, I'm at UMLV or whatever, and just kept pushing them to say, and they pushed the next level and the next level. And so on Friday, we were able to get it pulled again, in part because of pushing that side of it. And then our families come and tell the stories. Families are control the narrative. We have to have them control the narrative. So we get the emotion and the data and we just keep working on it.
Amazing. I really appreciate that. I was actually going to ask you how you were sort of responding to like new moves by the department, but you sort of mentioned bringing the families together and like lifting them up. And so I think that's really powerful. Maybe we can actually turn to Taj real quick, because I would like to learn more about what's happening in Virginia. So Taj, while Nevada was able to sort of get ahead of these bad policies, a lot of the humanization project's work on visitation sort of revolved around changing the policies that were already in place. Um, can you talk a bit about what sort of issues that incarcerated folks were and their families were facing with visitation in Virginia and how that impacted folks?
Yes, absolutely. So, first of all, though, again, whole Virginia Family Access Coalition, everything, the Humanization Project, definitely a big part of it, but shout out to everybody. All of this reflects all of that work, and I want to make sure that's always centered. Um, so between COVID and the interruption of COVID on visitation fundamentally everywhere, and the long-running Department of Corrections desire to, as was noted earlier, kind of view visits as something that's an annoyance that we have to deal with and therefore discourage them as much as possible. That was the cultural mindset for many years, but it had only been chipped away at. And then COVID showed up. And then when they reinstated visits, they did so with an attitude that was full of mistreatment for visitors in various ways. And I'll describe a couple of those in a second. And then also with greatly reduced access. And the combination of the two led to a 92% reduction in visits between the year before COVID and the year after COVID. A 92% reduction through both structural and cultural changes, which means you de facto eliminated visits. That's crap. And to the mistreatment side, the particular things that were happening were one, generally arbitrary denials of visits, as was discussed earlier, when people go all that way, put in the money, the time, getting off work, and then they're turned away, and there was no recourse, right? They were just somebody there at the desk said, "You're not coming in today," and turn around and you can complain on Monday if you want. Often that's centered specifically on arbitrarily interpreted dress codes. Um, it's not the only time it happened by any means, but there's a really good example. A friend of mine, Michelle, she's been going for decades. She has a very phenomenal career in which she's a leader in a big company. She's a parent. She has raised wonderful children, and she has a partner who's been locked up for a long time. She's been going faithfully without any involvement in anything sideways, and she's gotten to know people over the years. And he's a model inmate, which I hate that term, but that's what everybody wants to say, right? That's what we're talking about. He had recently, after years of going to visits every weekend, he had gone and told somebody inside the facility that somebody else who worked there was playing some games that were inappropriate with somebody and had initiated an investigation on an employee. That employee's friend, when Michelle, his wife, showed up for the visit that weekend, all of a sudden a shirt she'd worn many times before to the same visitation room was not enough. And she had to go buy a shirt at a dollar store and miss half of her scheduled visit. And in other cases, it's you can't come back at all, or whatever the case may be. And then discouraging people from coming. So that's the mistreatment side. The access side is they did a bunch of changes all of a sudden with the reinstatement after COVID. Not only did they make it a digital scheduling system where you couldn't just go, but you only had your little limited time, and all of the previous practices of stay until the space is needed, that went away. When your time was done, you were getting kicked out. They stopped doing regular long distance extended visits or coming multiple days on the weekend if you come a long way or you don't come frequently, which was something that had been standard practice you just had to put in before. Um, and to the earlier point, they made a point of instituting a rule that you would lose 2 years of visits for a single dirty urine or a number of other disciplinary violations, which is punishing whole families because somebody is feeling isolated during COVID and is self-soothing, which is literally what's happening, as was Sarah did such a good job of describing. So those things were all happening, and that one alone, over 2,000 people in the Department of Corrections did not have visits at the time we found out at the beginning of this year because of just that reason. And I think an example of this, of the illustrative effect of this, is I would quickly say, so my family, as I said earlier, kept me going through those visits. Survival and then a reason to thrive. They were my motivation. Like every time something happened, if somebody was pushing something at me, an employee or a resident, is this worth not going to that visit? And the answer was always no. My mom and I got very close. I supported her a lot as she had physical, mental health problems, all sorts of stuff going on, and we were relying on each other. She would come every 6 months, spend thousands of dollars that she saved up just to see me all weekend on a long weekend from New Mexico. And we'd done this every 6 months when you were allowed, no problems. She got on the first plane available once visits were reinstated. We did all the paperwork, got everything scheduled. She also scheduled in the new portal. The day before that visit, a month after I'd put in for it, I got a note saying, "We don't do special visits like that anymore. Sorry." She was already there. She'd already spent money she didn't have. She had long COVID. It was directly impacted her in all sorts of ways. She got there. We're like, "We'll talk to somebody." The people in charge that day said, "Oh, well, the new policy is we can't make any decisions here." And then it was a 1 hour scheduling block. So she had come, spent $2,000, come 2,000 miles, and she got kicked out of an empty room with not a single person in it, not a single person waiting after 1 hour, and she never came back again. That's what people were going through.
Remarkable. I had similar issues happen with me and my family coming from other state to see me, and it just it's heartbreaking to know that sort of happened. So what kind of changes were you and the coalition in Virginia able to bring about then?
So we started with 3 bills
Hmm.
this year, um, after a year and a half long campaign to get to that point and convince a bunch of legislators. Two of those bills ended up passing. One improved the treatment of visitors. The other one improved access to visitation, and both of them included work groups where the things we couldn't get done this year substantively in legislation, we came back together and it already started one iteration. I think there's going to be more where there was a coming together with the Department of Correction and the coalition members and some other stakeholders to come up with new suggestions for further improvements. The bill that passed about improved treatment of visitors had two primary elements right now. The first one was that dress codes would be standard and measurable across the state and are not allowed to differ facility to facility and have to be measurable. And the second one, and I think is even more important, is that if you want to stop somebody from going to a visit when they've shown up for any reason, dress code or otherwise, you not only have to provide them with a written documentation on the spot of what rules they violated, but also you cannot do that until you get approval, not just from somebody at that facility, but from a regional director or higher. So there has to be an on-the-spot accountability to deny somebody a visit. And some degree of evidence. I mean, we all know departments of corrections evidence, as Jodi alluded to, but still definitely progress, some skin in the game. The other bill about access, the things that were improved already substantively in the law. First, that they would maximize safe seating capacity because they had reduced the number of seats in the same rooms after COVID. The measures of that are still being worked out, but they've already improved it considerably. Over 160 seats in visitation rooms have been added since. I think there's more to go. Also that they would no longer kick people out of empty rooms. If the space is available, once you're there, you may stay, which is a really big thing if you come a long way and then somebody kicks you out of an empty room. Two, that long distance visitors will get some extra time. It's not quite what was before of like all day, all weekend, but at least more time that day or an extra day. And that there will no longer be permitted to take visitation away from people except when the violation occurred during visitation. So there is no more using family access as a cudgel to make people supposedly behave by law. That's probably the biggest piece of that in effect.
That's amazing. No one should have that connection removed. For firstly, because it just creates more harm. It creates more and more harm. It compounds it, and it's so necessary, and it's just not human to do so. Speaking of which, the humanization project's overarching strategy is I find it really interesting because it's humanizing justice reform and in a way that makes change. I'm kind of curious how you were able to use that strategy to sort of change things in Virginia. in particular?
Yeah, I am very proud of how effective humanization has been as an agent of change. I think it works in any field, but I think it's particularly apt in this one where so much of our starting point is based upon stereotypes and reductions of people to their conviction. We
Mhm.
talk about inmate, offender, et cetera, or whatever the case may be. And so what we always, and what I learned and what we apply is that um, if you know one thing about somebody and it's inmate, offender, convict, felon, murderer, rapist, robber, whatever, and that thing, no matter how progressive you are, is inherently negatively tinged, it's hard to get past that. But if you know seven things about somebody, even if you strongly dislike one of them, the other six things you like makes that person your friend and you treat them with humanity and compassion. And so if we can get everybody to understand us, our human experience of the justice system, because everybody who experiences it knows how messed up it is. All it takes is being near it in a human way for a little while, and everybody gets convinced something needs to be done. So if we can share that, let the voice be about what this really feels like for loved ones, for those who are inside, for those who are coming home, then it's harder to reduce us to just that label. And the more we interact with people and show people we're not that label, the better we can do. And this has been very effective legislatively in Virginia, not just from us, from a whole host of organizations, and it's been building over time. But in the process, especially on something like protecting family access, if you start a conversation with a legislator, regardless of the letter in parentheses next to their name, and you say, what was your source of salvation and strength and motivation when you had the hardest time in your life? Invariably, the answer is. And I think everybody then can understand why family connections in tough times are important. And when we had a whole bunch of stories about family members being mistreated in very real, very vivid, very actual face-to-face conversation terms, it's really hard to think that we should defend these practices.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Jodi,
Oh,
oh, I'm
I
sorry.
want to add to the bipartisan support thing just real quick.
Yes.
100% yes. Both of those visitation bills that passed had widely bipartisan votes in both chambers at different times to be specifically answer that.
That is that's remarkable because the times when we sort of need that in a lot of places, I know there are a lot of folks who are, some of the worst policies we see are in places where you really need bipartisan support to sort of get it through. Um, and Jodi, I also wanted to sort of bring it back to you because I know that you have also had some success around visitation in Nevada and have done a lot of work there. And just kind of like to learn more about that as well.
So thank you. As I was jumping out of my seat, I was like, please, I hope we're going to talk about this. So, like I said, all of our, like anything that we take on, a fight we take on came from people or families, like impacted people somewhere, right? One of the things that we were able to win in 2023 was we did win protection for in-person visitation when tablets were implemented, which I was talking about before. So we were able to protect that. It's not going perfectly because what they've done is reduce visitation, but we're coming back for that next session. But one of the most significant bills and one of my favorite bills that we have won was really brought to my attention just from our own family. My husband went to prison in, well, really, he was a juvie lifer in California first and then in Nevada. His mother had been previously incarcerated. He was born in prison, so it went all the way back to his birth that she had felonies and was dealing with drug addiction. They were never allowed to visit because she had a prior felony. And that's a common thing that we see is that people get automatically excluded from visitation. In Nevada, it was like a blanket. If you had a felony, you were not ever going to visit your loved one. So when we look at like what Sarah was talking about, the disproportionate effect that that has on Black and Brown families who have been trapped by mass incarceration, it was very impactful and we won that. It still is not working perfectly. I literally appealed one 2 days ago where they've denied her 4 times on a 21-year-old warrant that she didn't know she had. But we'll beat it. I probably have overturned like 200 visitation denials. I shouldn't have to if they did the process correctly, but we have the protection for people. And so that no longer is an automatic exclusion in Nevada.
That's amazing. That's amazing work. So we're kind of coming up on the Q&A section, but I do want to just kind of touch a couple of questions here. Um, Firstly, because substance use is an increasingly it is a problem in prisons, and it's increasingly so. But the push to sort of restrict or eliminate family connections, like it seems like it's an increasingly common response. Um, what do you say to folks who are saying that we need to do this to keep people safe? And conversely, at the same time, can we talk about some of the human impacts? Like what kind of effects is your work having on families, on people?
My turn. Um, Shoot, I forgot the question.
No worries. I would just say, what would you say
ADHD, just please, grace is all I need.
no worries. What do you say to people who say that we need to
Oh,
cut off family connections to keep people safe? And what are some of the impacts of on families of the work that you all have done of not cutting people off?
I mean, my common comment is like two words, prove it. Prove that it works. Prove that it's going to keep drugs out of prisons. Prove that it's going to make things better for people on reentry. Prove that what you're saying is going to actually do something good. Because if it's not, then we have to look at every other option before physical mail. We lucked out because NDOC, for some reason, in their data study, literally quoted, I think it was CCA, I can't remember who they quoted, but some correctional institute. And the director has said to me, it's like playing whack-a-mole. If we close the mail, supply and demand supply is going to change, but demand is not going to change. And so all it's going to do is raise the prices, and we're going to have drones, and we're going to have COs more actively bringing them in. So if we know that is the reason, like, why do we not knee-jerk reaction and be like, let's take the mail in the hopes that it looks like we're doing something serious when really you're doing something destructive? So that's my response, but I tend to be a little outspoken sometimes. I probably could say it in a nicer way, but I don't usually. Um, and then, I mean, the human impact is, I think I told you a story. I don't remember who I told it to. So at the hearing that we had last week, this is just one example. We have these two little girls. Their mom might be on here, I'm not sure. Twins, they're 8 years old. Their dad is incarcerated, has been incarcerated for a long time. Um, but also has been doing become model MA. I hate that word too, Tosh. I never use it. But he does something with his girls. They read stories, they talk. He's very interactive as a parent with them. And so recently, one of them did not do well on a math test. And so he sent her math tests to practice. Here's your practice worksheets. She has to do them and send them back to her. Like the human impact is like everywhere. I can't tell you how many times I would hear about a stabbing or a fight or a riot when my husband is out of prison and actually now deceased a few months later. But the terror, like people will be at work in bathrooms. I'm going to start crying, like really struggling just to keep it together on a day-to-day basis. I have someone, I'm sorry if you could tell, I was texting someone today who's like, I haven't heard from him in 2 days. He went to classification and I haven't heard back from him yet. And they're panicked, right? There is a nonstop in that very larger circle. We can think about this through all of the benefits communication does for the person who's impacted, who's in prison, but that circle of how people function in the world with a loved one that's incarcerated is a public health crisis, in my opinion, that we never talk about, except for in spaces like this.
I'm going to add on very quickly. I think you covered most of the key points here, Jody, but I think that one thing you said, prove it. I will say we can actually disprove your theory because when they stopped visits during COVID in Virginia, there was a spike in overdoses. So shut up, is the answer. The evidence says otherwise. Don't be ridiculous. Also, I will say that more broadly speaking, all human societies, for as long as we can look back, the altering of our consciousness is something we have done everywhere. It is rises to the place of abuse and misuse and problems as a symptom of other things going on in society. The more isolated people feel, the less hope they feel, the more likely we are to have abuse and misuse of substances, especially ones that are particularly dangerous. So isolating people further, cutting them off from the people who provide the actual unconditional love and support that are going to not just get them through a tough time, but be there to help them rebuild afterwards. The idea that that is somehow protective is the most ludicrous evidence opposite statement that has ever existed to anybody with a brain.
I 100% agree. Thank you so much for that. There's so much more I want to actually get into, but we have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now for some Q&A. But just thank you so much for sharing and for your insights.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and thank you to the many, many people in the question and answer who have put both questions and comments about what we're talking about here. The first question I have is I'm going to combine two questions. So the first question was directly to Taj, which was, as you talked about visits being reduced by 92%, the number of people that had been affected by disciplinary tickets. The question was, how did you get those numbers? And then I will add on another question because I think it goes with this. Once you have numbers, how do you get people to care about them?
Those are two very different answers. I am a sociologist with this hat, and I am an impacted person with this hat. And so the one gives me the training to navigate ridiculous bureaucratic systems with determination and resolve. The other one is to be able to know what this actually means, right? And so both of those were involved as a collective answer. To the getting the information, I will not exaggerate this at all. It took me 17 FOIA requests to DOC to get the language right, to get them to actually send me back the document that I thought they probably had. 17, and it included an actual getting a call received from their FOIA officer to yell at me, actually raise her voice and yell at me about all of what I was asking for. And I said, I know how spreadsheets work. If you have this other thing that I've seen published, I know that means you have the root numbers that you can also send me. But it took a lot of persistence and willingness to navigate those systems, and I have not tried to email her since because I don't think I'm ever going to get an answer again. But I got it. They don't generally keep good records. That is one thing that this work group is working on. And two, the new leadership of the Department of Corrections of Virginia, starting this year under a new governor, everything has been overhauled and they're doing a lot better. I want to make sure I credit where it's due. They are at least willing to work with us on developing a data system. That is to me very important exactly for this reason. So somebody doesn't have to ask 17 FOIA requests. So taking that hat off, how do I get anybody to care about that? Because once I had that number, Visitation has been a domestic experience in Virginia for years. We already had the stories. I've been talking with not just the one I shared of my mom's experience, but lots of people like that. So then I had the number that was going to make this concrete. Well, how do we get somebody? And that's the question of using existing relationships with legislators to say, here's this thing we would really like to tell you about. So a little bit of rapport and respect has to be developed to get somebody to give you an audience like that. You have to be taken seriously enough, provide enough evidence, like actual concrete evidence that it's not just a couple people complaining, because that's always the assumption about our community, right? And then prepare as a team collectively, like who thinks that this is something that their story will highlight? Who thinks, because 7 stories in a room, which is what we actually did to a handful of legislators together at once and said, this is what's happening. And each conceptual point was backed up by a very obviously true from a very reasonable person standpoint. Now they care. It's got evidence and it's got heart, and now they care.
Jody, anything you want to add? Just want to give you a chance if you want to.
No, I think that what Taj was talking about is exactly what has to happen is it is that balance of storytelling and building narratives and showing if Taj is the only one saying it, guess what? That's one person's problem. That is what we do. That's how we just won the mail is we had hundreds of statements from incarcerated people and families and everybody telling the story, and then organizations step in to bring the data and that other's perspective, and collectively it has been working. I will say the only thing that, especially around visitation, Nevada doesn't collect data and FOIA requests, they don't have to create a new report for something that they don't already collect. So it's suspicious to me that they don't collect it, but when we have had issues where they said that they don't collect something, I have taken a different approach, which I'm very impatient. So I was like, I could never do 17 FOIAs. But what we did is we use a survey response with our members that are incarcerated. So we have about 3,000 known members out of an 11,000 population. So it gives us almost a third of the people. And so we'll be like, hey, they don't collect data. So we collected our own. Maybe in the future they should start watching this so we can have what the real numbers are, even though ours are usually better than theirs. But that's just another option. We use that a lot.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a really good point. That sometimes when data is just not available, you have to figure out how to gather it yourself. The next question I'm going to direct to everybody, but I actually know that Emmett has a little bit to say about it. Somebody asked, there's a concern that mail scanning is also a way of involving AI more in surveillance or harvesting of incarcerated people's data. And is that an ongoing conversation?
I think it should be more of a conversation, frankly. So we have seen things from certain mail scanning companies that AI is sort of being used to sort of identify threats and communication. And some of those threats are not so much threats of violence or threats of drugs or something like that, but just coarse language or a language that can be framed as abusive, or however the case may be. And so yeah, there are absolutely AI is absolutely they're scanning mail scanning with AI capabilities that absolutely do just that, and limit the conversation in ways that are not protecting anyone at all.
Yeah.
We just got,
Go ahead.
sorry, Sarah. We just actually, our campaign on physical mail, it was called the Fight to Write. And we had to change it to the Right to Write, spelled differently on each one, because it was getting flagged by getting out in GTL messages, every message that we sent. I would have to stop, put a period in it, add extra T, like do something so that it wouldn't get flagged. It wasn't worth it. So we changed the name. And that is a AI like inhibiting language. And I wasn't gonna fight anybody.
And then the last question I'll ask is a more general one that we got from a number of people. One from the director of a new nonprofit organization, and then another from just sort of an average person asking, how can folks on the outside who are passionate about this issue, but maybe don't have incarcerated family members, or don't have a direct connection to someone on the inside, how can they get involved? How can they help with these efforts?
I would love to take that one,
Go,
if you don't mind.
be
Thank you.
free.
Um, I think that like if you're not personally impacted, it's as important that you step up and in for people who are. Like sometimes, I don't know why I'm getting so emotional. Sometimes being like directly impacted is absolutely exhausting, and you're trying to fight a system on a personal level while you're also trying to change a system. And I think plugging in with organizations that are doing this work. If you're running an organization that is, like I used the example earlier, a housing alliance organization, I guarantee a ton of your people are impacted by incarceration and housing laws. Like plugging into the people that are doing work that is specific, and that's where those coalitions come in. Recently, on Friday, when we had this hearing, there was a woman she might be on here today, who is relatively new. I just recently met her, and she is passionate about helping with this work. So we ended up being able to pull back and not needing to show up that day. But when we thought we were going to have to show up en masse, she hit a vein with a whole nother group of people that never talked to us. They're not thinking about prison and prison families. She had multiple political organizations, women's organizations, all these. And she was like, I'm getting everybody that's at home during the day, like, we're not doing anything. We're all going to be there and back you guys up. Back us up. Find who is in your area and just ask them, what can I do to support you?
All right.
So,
Taj, anything you want to add to that? Go ahead.
no, go ahead. We're short on time. I
No,
will.
you're good. Well, thank you all so much. I really, this conversation has been really meaningful, and I think has really gotten at some of the details and nitty-gritty of how advocacy work actually happens, that are exactly the kinds of things that we need to be sharing with each other and with our fellow advocates, so that we can replicate the successes that y'all have had elsewhere. So I'm going to quickly just close out by talking a little bit about how to get in touch with us, and how else to get involved. So please sign up for Prison Policy Initiative's newsletter. You can find us at prisonpolicy.org/subscribe. I promise we do not spam you, but we do send you updates on our work, on interesting research we find, lots of other things. We also have social media on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, where we post all sorts of stuff. And then the last pitch I want to give is for our advocacy department. Emmett, me, and then Alex Kajstura, who's been helping out with the Q&A, comprise Prison Policy Initiative's advocacy department. And what we do is we work with grassroots groups like Return Strong and the Humanization Project and lots of other groups. We work with legislators. We work with all sorts of advocates who are working on lots of issues in criminal legal system reform. We generally say we work on everything from arrest to parole, where the whole experience of incarceration and prosecution is part of what we work on. We provide legislative testimony and public comment. We provide research support, and we also just provide a sounding board and brainstorming help for anything you might be interested in. If you want to get started working with us, if you're one of these grassroots organizations, or if you're a legislator who wants to talk to us, send us an email at advocacy@prisonpolicy.org to get started. And with that, I think I will close us out. Thank you, Jodi. Thank you, Taj. Your wisdom has been invaluable here, and I really, really appreciate you and all the work you've done, and wish you all the best in the good fight. And thank you, Emmett, for all your great work moderating this as well. And with that, I will close us out. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I will also say the thing that everyone is going to ask me: yes, this webinar was recorded. Yes, we will send out the link, and we will also send a link. We'll also put together a page with a bunch of resources that are from both Prison Policy Initiative and other organizations on this topic, and we will send you a follow-up email sometime next week. Thank you all so much for coming, and I
Thank
appreciate you
you.
all. Bye-bye.